When I was in high school, my parents moved out to a farm far out in the country, which felt to me at first like a horrible disaster in my life. But I grew to really appreciate it over time. I often used to hike into the hills above our farm. And on one of those hikes, I was sitting by myself high up on the ridge, looking out over the beautiful valley below, and all at once, I was overwhelmed by an indescribable sense of the unity of all things, including me. It was a deep sense of belonging, almost a sense of being held by someone, by God, I guess, except that the sense was that God was in everything, and everything was holding me, welcoming me, even loving me. And I don't know how long it lasted, but even after it passed, I felt as though I had seen something or come to know something I had not known before, that I belonged, that everything belonged, and that everything was held together in some way by a holy love. And even though it was the early 70s, I can assure you this was a completely natural experience. There were no alternative sources of that feeling. And I never forgot that feeling, and it returned to me from time to time over the years. But on that day, after it passed, like always, whenever you have a mountaintop experience, I still had to go down the mountain, back to my normal life with my somewhat normal parents, and chores and homework, and all the normal mundane things that make up the life of a high school teenager. And that's the way it is in our lives, right? Many years later, I learned that what happened to me is called a unitive mystical experience. A sublime mystical experience of unity, experienced by many people through the ages, and maybe something like that has happened to you too. It can take many different forms for people. As the biblical scholar wrote, the coming of God's glory into the midst of human reality is no ordinary event. It doesn't allow for precise description, yet the Bible asserts that God's presence does indeed invade and inhabit our lives and our world. And those who experience such things often describe the experience as a divine light or presence or voice that comes to them and leaves them changed in some real or significant way. And for me, that's part of the key of an experience like this, that it does leave you changed in some way, or gives you some new insight versus just being fun or scary, perhaps, or something like that. Sometimes experiences of the divine presence are associated with significant spiritual leaders or moments of transformation in the life of a people. In today's reading from Exodus, Moses and the bringing of the law to ancient Israel are associated with the revealing of God's presence in a cloud, in light like a devouring fire, and in a voice. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann wrote, after waiting on the mountain for 7 days, there is this voice, a voice hidden in a cloud, mediated as glory. The voice of the Holy One calls to Moses, addresses him, and summons him. God's speech, Brueggemann writes, is the center of the text, the center of Moses' experience, and the center of Israel's faith. Later, when Israel remembers their encounter with God, it is said that the people heard only the sound of the words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. That's all Brueggemann wrote. The form would have been for Moses a stable assurance, but there was no form, no firm assurance. There was, however, a voice. A voice that offered a fresh start to them as a people, a sense of covenant or unity with God and with one another, as well as guidance about how to live into the future. The people of Israel would never forget that voice, that moment of encounter with the Holy up on the mountain, even through long years of struggle when both God and hope seemed far away. In later years, the kings of Israel would lay claim to being the agents of God's glory as a way of affirming their right to the throne. An example of this is Psalm 2, which was another possible reading for today, a so-called royal psalm because it was probably connected with the inauguration of a new king. It may have been sung or performed at an inauguration of a new king of Israel. And in it, the king is identified as God's agent, one who is described both as God's son, that may sound familiar, and God's anointed one, in Hebrew the word for Messiah, or in ancient Greek for the Christ. So many scholars have pointed out that the early church's use of these terms to describe Jesus were a way of flipping the script, more or less. This is what God's anointed one looks like, not the king. This is what God's Messiah looks like, not someone who's just seeking life over others or something like that. Of course, through the ages, almost every king and every powerful country has attempted to claim God's blessing on their power and their policies, no matter how onerous they may be. Even our presidents are inaugurated by making an oath on the Bible. And so far, virtually all of them in recent years make a point of having some pastor or religious leader as a spiritual advisor, regardless of how religious or non-religious the president really is, right? Or how moral or immoral their policies may be. It's more of a symbol, I think, a symbol to sort of lay claim a little bit to divine blessing upon whoever the president may be. And unfortunately, many of us seem to buy into this co-opting of the divine presence, even though the voice we hear in the Bible, a voice which calls us, addresses us, summons us, and leaves us changed, is almost nowhere to be found in the political life of our nation or any other nation. This is where the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus comes into play. As many scholars have pointed out, it reflects the story of Moses in a very intentional way. Jesus goes up the mountain with only a few chosen followers. Once there, his face shines like the sun, just like Moses' face. A cloud overshadows him, just like on Mount Sinai, and a voice speaks out of the cloud, just like that other story. The voice we hear in the Jesus story repeats the same words heard at Jesus' baptism. "This is my beloved child, with whom I am well pleased." Clearly, the story implies that Jesus is the inheritor of the holy presence, the divine blessing for the people of Israel. And Peter thinks he knows what to do to mark the moment and the place. He wants to do what most of us want to do when we have a profound experience. Build a temple, build a tabernacle, build a place to worship and try to hold on to that experience. So that's what he calls for. But is neither the point nor the end of the story for Jesus or the disciples. It's interesting to note that this time when the divine voice speaks in Matthew, there are 3 words added to what was said at the baptism. 3 words that are critical to understanding the meaning of this experience. "This is my beloved child, with whom I am well pleased." Then it continues, "Listen to him." Listen to him. The point of the story is not simply to worship him, but to follow him, to listen to him, to live in new ways that reflect all the things Jesus taught them and showed them along the way. Jesus doesn't seek to be worshipped like a god or to lay claim to the divine presence like a king for the purposes of power. Jesus seeks to release that presence into the lives of his followers and into the world. "The Spirit of God is upon me," he says in Gospel of Luke, reading from Isaiah. "God has anointed me." The Spirit of God is upon me. The presence is upon me. Divine presence is upon me. God has anointed me, the anointed one, to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of God's favor, the year of Jubilee for all. It's all flowing outward from Jesus. It's not all flowing inward. The presence is flowing outward from him. We should always be wary of those who wish to claim the authority of those religious leaders, political leaders, celebrities, cultural icons. We should be wary of those who wish to claim the authority or blessing of God to affirm their own status or power. And we should always be wary of our own tendencies to let someone do that on our behalf. Because nobody can. No one can own God's blessing. God's blessing is not the divine right of kings or presidents. It belongs to no one, yet calls to everyone. The voice that Moses heard on the mountain and that urged the disciples to listen to Jesus still speaks in our hearts, in our world today, still calls us, addresses us. and summons us to go back down the mountain and into the world, to change the world in ways that reflect God's mercy and justice and peace. That the light that shined on the face of Moses and Jesus now shines on our faces and is meant to shine through our lives. The great Jewish mystic and theologian Martin Buber wrote, "Time and again our images of God must be broken. The images must be broken, but the voice is never silenced. The voice speaks to all generations. It makes demands on us and summons us to accept responsibility. It's of the utmost importance not to lose one's openness, but to be open means to not shut out the voice, call it what you will, because it doesn't matter what you call it," he said. "All that matters is that you hear it. All that matters is that you hear the voice on the mountain and strive to be attentive to it as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the new day dawns and the morning star rises in our hearts." The voice on the mountain still calls to us, sisters and brothers, seeking to transfigure our lives and our world into the shape of God's love. The only question is whether we will listen.